Thanks as always for listening to Fluff and Crunch. Today, I talk with my buddy Steve about dueling in the Dune 2D20 role-playing game. It's one of the 5 forms of conflict that the system offers using the same core mechanic, and yet it is by far the most complicated and challenging of any of them. Be sure to like, subscribe, join our Discord community, leave comments, and let us know what you think. Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. I appreciate you coming on again to talk about this, frankly, confusing, call it vexing set of rules that we find in the Dune 2D20 RPG about dueling. Now, really quickly, I mean, you put together a 30-page PDF with some great graphics and really clear and detailed explanation of how the system works, and using a notional example that I've gone through and read and reread and made sense of and things like that. So we're gonna talk through that. We'll talk through some other examples that you have, but really quickly before we dive into dueling as one of the forms of conflict in Dune, is I want to remind people, I mean, if you're not familiar with the game, is that it has an interesting, and that with all the attendant, implications, interesting good, interesting bad, interesting complicated, action economy, which is highly abstract. And I know that some folks that I've only played the game a few times, that have talked about it with a lot of people. Some people, they really get hung up on and in a way I think distracted by how abstract this system, the conflict system, that is the pieces of the conflict system that are universal throughout the different modes of conflict in Dune. So could you take a minute and give us a quick primer on what this whole idea of using and moving assets and then these different kinds of conflicts, and then we can dive into dueling.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the right way to approach it. There is an aspect to 2D20 and as an application to Dune that can be jarring to some folks who come from traditional play RPGs or RPGs that lean more on the crunch aspects than the fluff aspects. So yeah, let me talk a little bit about that, and then we'll dive into the dueling aspect of it. So assets and zones. Dune is built around a concept that it is a game that mimics and follows along the traditions of domain play games. So think of things like if you're familiar with like second edition Dungeons and Dragons Birthright, or I think there's a newer version, a new game called Axe, Adventurer Conqueror King system. These games emphasize the ability of the player character to ascend to a higher status and be a leader of a large domain of resources. So with Dune, and the based on the storyline, a lot of what transpires is on that level of play: intrigue, espionage, taking over planets,
like warfare. Yeah, bigger picture things.
So when Nathan and I think the team went in and started designing it, and I had an opportunity being in on the playtest very early in 2020, I kind of got a chance to see all this. They wanted to create a light as enough rule system that could accommodate that domain level play without writing a huge amount of volume of rules to do detailed mechanics and things where you start to get more towards the simulation side of things and heavier crunch, more like on the Conan perspective, and keep it at that very high level. So that design philosophy,
any game, and I'm thinking warfare in particular, like large scale combat. This has been attempted many times in all the decades of RPGs, and sometimes successfully and sometimes not. Obviously, it's a preference and taste issue, but when you have a unified mechanic, adapting the unified mechanic from the personal, the individual level to the mass level is really challenging. So
Yeah.
I could see where they were trying to, they didn't want to create a different system. They didn't want to take the 2D20 system and say, well, here's the version when you're just face to face, but then we have this whole other version of the system when we're doing, when you're attacking a planet. So they needed to figure out a way to make this work for all those different levels. That's really challenging.
Precisely. It is. It is. And when part of the challenge lies in the fact that there's going to be things that are not defined. It's going to be let free form. There was a rule discussion on the Modifius Discord that myself and Andy Peregrine, the lead for Dune, jumped in on, which was evolving right around that particular question. It's like, well, what do you do in this kind of a detailed situation? I won't go into the specifics of it. You guys can look it up if you want to. It's up there. But I made the statement. It's like, yeah, this was left loose for you to define what you wanted to do there as a GM and how do you wanted to arbitrate it. The system is by that token, it achieves what it wanted to do. It really gives you that sense of encompassive capability of your house, as it were, right? To run planets, to do all those domain activities that's built into the system. And you see that in the Great Game and Power and Pawns supplements. But when it gets down to now the nitty gritty, and you try to apply it, as you were saying, Jeremy, to like hand-to-hand combat, the things are now ill-defined and it's a little bit loose, so it can lead to confusion. There's always that balance. And that's where I think what we've seen in discussions on the forums, and I'm not too active on the forums anymore. I just stick to the Discord because it's one place. But you see a lot of discussions about like, well, how do I run this duel, and what about skirmish, and what do I do there, and when do I switch between duel and skirmish? And you have a lot of questions that are naturally generated because of that design philosophy. Not bad questions, good questions, but they do come up.
So okay, for the sake of our listeners, watchers, whatever, define dueling per the Dune rulebook. What makes dueling a unique form of conflict, and the only one we're going to focus on moving forward here in the rest of our discussion?
Yep. So dueling is different from the other forms of conflict. You have espionage, intrigue, warfare, skirmish, and dueling. And dueling is the one conflict type that is really individual, person on person. Skirmish is multiple people. Warfare is now large armies. Intrigue, espionage can be one-on-one, but it is usually within a web of other activities.
Yeah, it's one-on-one organizational level. This is This is two individuals. So dueling is always and only two individuals fighting one another hand to hand.
Correct.
Okay, explain to me how, because, and I'd mentioned this earlier, but Dune uses this action economy of assets. And on your turn, you can move an asset or use, or rather, is it or is it and?
It's or.
Okay, so you can move an asset or use an asset. And in the case of dueling, like a knife would be an asset. So this is where I think the first step where people get confused. Move, use. How would you use a knife? I'm going to stab you with it. Oh, no. There's something you have to do first in dueling, in this taking this highly abstract conflict system and then turning it into something that actually requires more specificity and detail. So walk us through the steps of how do you duel? So you have the two characters, they have their crysknives, they square off against one another, and what happens?
Right. Magic. The way I put it at the beginning of my document, which I know you'll share, is you stick them with a pointy end, right? That's the thing. I got a knife in my hand, I want to stick with it. Well, because of that philosophy we talked about moving assets through zones and taking those actions, and then taking zones and now making it basically an individual versus an individual. You look at the zone map for a duel, you have those two people facing off one another, and you have 3 zones per person. You have a right zone, a left zone, and then you have a personal zone, which represents the body. And those two things face off against each other. Of course, the right hand of one person facing the other one is opposite of the right hand of the person facing them. And that's classically how they show that zone map. And if you have Agents of Dune, you can see it in there. I put that in as a map. And it's also written in the core book that shows it that way. So when the battle starts, and the way I've laid out in my document there is I show it in various steps. I showed it from the simplest perspective, which is two fighters, no defensive assets, and each one has a crysknife or a knife. I put a blade and a crysknife, I think, but two weapons effectively. And then I proceed to walk people through how you would move these assets into the zones of the opponent, how that asset could be moved into the personal zone where you could actually do damage. This is where the things start to cause a little bit of consternation.
This is where I said it seems to me at least to get a little weird. Like the idea that, wait a minute, you have this very abstract conflict system, but in this case, it actually gets extremely granular and actually very concrete in terms of the specific placement of things. So you first, before you can stab someone with the pointy end of said crysknife, you have to first take that asset and move it into the proper zone. So like within someone's left side defenses, and then help me out. Then you would use the asset to stick them with it.
You would effectively, at that point, you would take the action where you would use the asset, which would effectively, if you succeed, you'll cause damage. Now, the complexity of the fact that if you have a notable character or a higher level character, like the player character, you have opposed roles and they are extended tasks, effectively, to defeat the other. And you've seen this through the 2D20 design. When you got someone important to defeat them, it's an extended task versus just one injury and they're gone, like a mook.
Mooks go down with one. And then there's the noteworthy that take a little bit more to knock them down. Okay, so back to the thing. You have the two, they square off against one another. One of the characters goes first. Walk me through it. Make sense of it to me.
Yeah. So this is the rules as written. Is what you've got is the let's say first character gets an action and doesn't move, right? And a move, as though there was some debate about move in the rules because it was kind of not explicitly stated. There's three types of move. There's a normal move where you are just moving the asset. It's effectively the cost is the action to move the asset to a zone. There is a subtle move and there is a bold move. The bold move and the subtle move are the action as the cost plus a test. And you can fail or pass that test. If you pass the test, then you get a bonus. There is some advantage you've gotten for your move there. In bold, it's you can move one of the other person's or the other player's assets or the opponent's assets. With subtle, you reduce the cost of keep the initiative to 0. Keep the initiative, for those folks who don't know what that is it's an ability for after a successful test for one side of the conflict to be able to take another action or to continue the action sequence. So they get almost 2 turns, if you will. Or they can hand it to another player or another character on their side.
But in dueling, that wouldn't happen, would it?
Dueling, it would always be keep the initiative for the individual. Right. So typically what you see is, as I pasted out there, is the first thing will be moving it into a zone, the opponent's shield zone, if you will, the right or left guard zone, as they call it. Excuse me, I won't use the word shield. Shields make a lot more complexity to this. And that's where you get past page, 24, 25 in that document. You get into shields.
Because it's not already weird and complex enough. We want to add the rest of this. So just to make sure we're clear for people who aren't familiar with the Dune rules, when you choose to do something, you can do so in the standard manner, which you just do it, or you can do so boldly, or you can do so subtly. The action is the same. It's just you could potentially have an advantage that'll be reflected in like a bonus to you, mechanical bonus or so in the next moment or the next step, if you are successful on the roll to be bold or to be subtle. So the action is the same. It's just like the way that you do it could benefit you, but you have to roll to get that benefit.
And I think it's an elegant way of approaching it as someone who fenced in college competitively, there are feints and there are reposts and there are parries and there's things of this nature that can be abstracted and mimicked as bold versus subtle. So I like the way they had designed that. Then after, let's say, so let's get to that point where character one has now gotten their Chris knife, if you will, into the guard zone successfully, and then they're going to keep the initiative. Now, normally, in order to keep the initiative, you're going to have to do a subtle move. So where you start seeing some of the fuzziness and dueling is now, as you pointed out, there's no reason to hand initiative over to somebody else on your side because this is one-on-one combat. So you're almost always now going like, well, I'm going to try a subtle move to try to keep the initiative go down to zero from a cost of momentum perspective. You can always have momentum in your pool and you still keep the initiative by paying for the cost. This is important because you want to get that first strike on an individual to take them down a notch. So you want to be able to now move that asset, so a second move, and move it into their personal zone. And that's what I showed in the diagram. Effectively getting into the guard zone successfully, then moving it into the personal zone. Now, at that point, according to the rules as written, you kind of run out of actions. You can't keep the initiative for a third time. There might be some special abilities or whatnot that allow that, but I don't think that's really game breaking. So there you got to stop. Now you pass the turn over to the opponent. The opponent is going to be able to do their action economy.
So a key point here in this dueling, and this is where, like I said, it is extraordinarily granular, and actually it's quite slow. Each action you can't actually just stab someone. You have to move, you have to do things to get your knife or your fist or whatever to the point where now that it's there, now you can later on hit them with it, stab them with it or something like that. And so it's jarring actually for, like, I don't know of any other game that does this, where you have so many steps before, like, I hit him. No. You have to move to this and then move to this and then later on you can hit him. So just that's something to remember. The dueling is thin sliced, and so it's going to take you multiple rounds, multiple actions on your behalf to get to the point where you can actually try to stick them with the pointy end of it.
Exactly.
So now it goes to the other player. You've gotten the knife past their guard. It's into their personal zone. It's right next to their side, but now it's their turn.
Yeah. I now have the opportunity of doing something. We could probably talk for several hours over all the details here, which we don't want to, because that's a little bit of the weakness of the system of dueling. And as you apply it to dueling, that's where the weakness comes in. It becomes too fiddly. There is all these things going on at the same time. And given the fact that you're doing tests as part of this now, so now the test where you're going to try to cause damage to the opponent. All of the mechanics of the rules for momentum spends and adding dice or determination or goodness, drives. Is a drive applicable? Do I?
Scene traits, asset traits, all those other things that make 2D20 such a great system that provides mechanical on-ramps to express narrative. All those things, they seem to maybe compound the complexity. And because you've thin sliced the steps into so many like little sub-steps and you're pouring all that onto each of those steps, it seems like it has the risk of burying people.
That's it. That's exactly the right analogy. The cover comes off and it's all exposed because you went from a large-scale zone map, like an espionage or intrigue map. And I got a couple here I can to show this, right? It's what I developed for Shaitan's Bargain, the adventure, right? And then trying to press that down into a one-on-one combat. And that's where things get a little fuzzy.
The point is that so we got the Chris knife, it's next to the dude's kidney, but now it's not his turn anymore. Now it goes to the other one. What potentially would the opposing character do in response to having this Chris knife right next to his kidney? It's his turn.
Right. So this is the interesting thing here, where there is, as we go down deeper into this fight, where the fuzziness just continues to build. So the other character can now do an attack themselves, right? There's also other options they can do, which is they can target an asset. So another action they could do is try to target that asset that now has moved into their personal zone. There's different
Which is
options they can
abstract
do.
Dune RPG speak for slap the knife out of the person's hand right next to you. But what
Right.
you're trying, this is one of the difficulties I have with this system personally is you're constantly translating terms in your mind. Okay, I have to. Okay, so you moved an asset, you used an asset and moved an asset. Which wait. Okay, that means you swung the knife at me. Now I'm going to. I'm gonna. Am I using an asset, my hand, or am I moving an asset to slap your asset? Which sounds like something we should call HR about. But what I mean, like what? That's where, again, I think that's one of the problems with this system is that it requires you to constantly translate these terms and concepts. So mechanically, how does one say slap and knock the blade out of the way with their hand?
Well, you just take an action and target the asset. If you're successful in targeting the asset, yes. And then the blade can go out of their hand. So I gave an example in there of someone disarming somebody. So it's in the document. So you can see that. You see, we're building this narrative here, and everyone's going like, my God, this is getting too complex. This is supposed to be a quick knife fight?
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the way Dennis directed Dune 1 and 2, and these things are fast.
Yeah.
Right? Look at where they come from. So Roger Yuan, who was the weapons master and the training master for the movies, right, based everything you saw there on a Filipino martial arts called Kali.
Okay.
And in that there is a subsection called Balintawak. And Balintawak is, and to be very short about it, everyone can go look it up, right? But it's short sticks. Effectively, you're fighting with very short batons.
Okay.
So the movements are like this. Josh Brolin called it like a ta 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 ta. That's the cadence that you see. And sure enough, when you either look at Gurney and Paul fighting it out in,
that's what you see.
You see it.
Yeah.
Or you go to the last epic duel with Paul Muad'Dib and Fade, right? It is pop, 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 pop,
Yeah.
pop, pop.
No, but what's happening though, I think what you need to remember on the RPG side is that you have slowed this down. So what happens on the screen and in the mind's eye at the table is this fast action thing. But in order to account for all those things, what the system is asking you to do is slow it down to like 1/10 or like super slow motion so that you're taking every little thing individually. So the character goes ahead and rolls and let's say knocks the knife away. Now, is that character's action? Can the character now try to stab the one that was trying to stab them, or are they done with their turn?
Well, it's the rules as written, right? They can try to keep initiative if they succeeded on targeting. And so that cycle just continues, right?
So let's say so back to this example, you move the asset, you finally get the knife through. The other character then goes ahead and knocks the knife away, spends to keep the initiative, moves his asset, a knife, next to the other character, but can't attack the other character.
Right. That's right. It stops. So during the final fight scene between Fade and Paul Muad'Dib and the Dune 2, it took 2 weeks to film that scene. Now, of course, we know how fast it goes.
Take to run it at the table too, I think.
So what's happened is we are effectively asking the players to basically film the scene for 2 weeks instead of experiencing it as a quick fight. This was identified as a sore spot, if you will, during the design phase.
I call it a problem. Let's just be honest.
Listen,
let's not. Hey, it's an issue. No, it's a problem.
It's a problem. It is. It was a problem, right? But everyone and Andy and the team at Modiphius, I mean, they're great to work with. They're on a tight schedule. Their profit margins, right? How thin things are. This is stuff you and Chris talked about, right? how much how much it costs to do the SRD. So there had to be a moving on, right? Here's the base system. Let's figure this out later, or let people judge it at the table, decide what they want to do. Maybe it's just one roll, and there it's over, right? And I'll tell you, we won't get into this here because we are running short on time. But when you start getting defensive assets, as the rules as written, added into the combat, it becomes even more complicated, particularly with that biggest problem they have in Dune for conflict is shield technology.
Correct.
And we won't go there right now, but if you looked at the talents and focuses and weapons, the assets within the core rulebook, you've got you have the slow blade as a talent, and you have shield fighting as a focus. Now, Paul is the only person that I could find that has shield fighting. So he's the only guy that has a benefit apparently from a focus called shield fighting.
Right.
But other than that, there's a bunch of people that do have the slow blade. Although interestingly, Duncan, Idaho's character, didn't have either slow blade or shield fighting. So, and what effectively, if you're going to go from canon, and there's a whole discussion about what Dennis did in the movie versus what the canon is, and how you get through shields.
Right. What you find
even Frank put a little hole in there. Yeah, Frank put a little hole in there with a slow pellet stunner. It's like the only weapon I can see that he wrote that can get through a shield, and then it it's dependent on physics. But if you add all that stuff in, it's now almost, if you're trying to add this stuff in, it makes it even worse, right? It gets more complicated, and that's where you get down at your page 25 to 30. All right, every defensive asset in a zone adds to the difficulty of the test. So difficulty for the person who's the attacker. And then let's add quality onto that. Now, if you've got quality associated with the assets, you have also mechanics you have to apply for the extended task.
This actually reminds me of like worst case high level Pathfinder first edition, or like worst case 3.5 high level, where there are so many variables and so many modifiers and things that you're piling on.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. Actually, let me say this to folks who are watching and listening. This 30-page PDF that Steve put together about how to do dueling is really excellent. It is really detailed. That is the process as written. And I think his take on it is excellent, because it's a combination of a text explanation and then graphics on each page that mirror and explain visually exactly what's happening. So I've got a link to that in the notes. So go take a look at that if you're interested in this, or you've been trying to wrap your head around this in the game. But let me ask you this in the time that we have left: how do you resolve this? Because the whole idea of like testing it at the table and just the designers being like, well, we're trying here, but we've created this Gordian knot that we've put around your head, or we're asking you to put around your head to run this. Frankly, it's one of the, I wouldn't say one of the high points of Dune, but it's one of those things that's Dune. You know, it's like it is an aspect of the world, dueling, that we see in the books and the movies. So how do you handle it? Or is this how you handle it at the table, using this graphic and hoping that your players are totally conversant in it?
It's just an important part. So this is a great lead into this. And you mentioned Pathfinder too. It's an interesting thing. So I avoid dueling currently while I'm playing and what have you. I do avoid dueling, or I handle it very easily, right? We go through it very quickly, and it is more a narrative function. However, there's an alternative scheme that I have been working on. I wanted to show you something way back. Let's go in a time machine back almost 5 years to when Dune was in the design cycle, and this was seen as a sore spot or a problem, as you would put it. There was an idea floated around about using the asset cards. Now, you have two sets of asset cards today that have been produced: an agent and an architect asset deck. And all those cards are the rules associated with the asset on a card format. And you can also find it in Agents of Dune too. One of the ideas that was floated around and looked at was just, do we use those cards to actually resolve the low-level conflict like for example, dueling, or we could even use it for negotiation or something like espionage. Let me show you this is from the past. This was something that was shared with the team. Me and Andy looked at it. This is something I drew up. It said, hey, what we can have is something where we have the asset cards reflect the asset and its quality and its rules. All the stuff would be on the card, and you can play these down on the table. This is particularly for one-on-one play, or you could even do this virtually if you had the resources to do it.
I see what you're saying. So you would use the assets. The two players would use the assets to offset one another potentially, depending on their nature. Is that
exactly
what I'm saying here?
Exactly. So I know folks who are listening on podcasts won't see this, but we can put this up on somewhere for you to look at.
We'll put a link to this graphic so you can download it.
Yeah. We'll send it out. But effectively, what it does is it allows two players to put their asset cards down, and then they can compare the results of those assets in the zones that they're playing them in all at one time.
Okay.
So, for example, you've had two assets that are on the PC side that are both +1, right?
Right. No, I see what you're saying.
Assets make things easier.
You have one. The NPC would 1-to-1 take one card to negate the +1, and then maybe dump another card on it to give it a -1.
Exactly. So this would be a quicker way of doing things. This is one approach that actually I've been trying to refine a little bit and see if I could get that into my next game, which I just want to make a little pump for. I'm putting together a campaign that works definitely on a domain level. So a lot of play by post would be a lot of domain turns, house management turns, and stuff like that. But I want to, if there's any dueling that comes up between players, and it's going to be a PvP kind of campaign, house versus house, player versus player.
This is how you think you're going to handle it.
I think I'm going to try this out and see how well it works.
I'm really interested. I would love to know how this card-based system develops, because I think that you could potentially have cards that fit various levels of conflict and really enrich, make things, I don't know, potentially it could simplify the overall process. If you, as you are listening or watching, if you have done this, that is, you have run dueling in Dune, I would love to know what your solution has been or your experience with it. If you have some other approach, if you have other questions, I'd love to know it. But yeah, it's a tough thing because it is a piece of the system, but it's the world rather. But it seems like something that I know folks that I've talked to, you included, and me, I have avoided because of how incredibly complex it is. But I recommend folks, you download that PDF, look at the graphics that you can download that Steve put together. I think this is by a long shot the best take on this complicated system that I've seen. I appreciate the effort that you put into this and being willing to try to make sense of at least some of the complexities of it so that maybe people can do something good with it.
Yeah, let's see how this alternate scheme works out. Maybe we can talk about it after I get some results.
No, I'd love to. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.